Hi guys. So let's do some reviewing for exam 1. The exam will open on Blackboard Monday, October 4th at 8 a.m. and it will close on Sunday, October 10th at 11:59 p.m. If you have questions or anything that you need in terms of reviewing for the exam or just questions about the study guide or something like that, please give me a call. What if you missed the exam? If you missed the exam and you didn't arrange an extension, then you're going to need to provide some documentation of a university recognized excuse. The excuse will need to account for the majority of the week. I'll accept your essay on a date that we agree between the two of us if you have a documented excuse. So the format of the exam. The exam has 2 parts. Please be sure that you do both parts. Part 1 is multiple choice. You have 60 minutes to take the exam. It's 30 questions. They're worth 2 points apiece for a total of 60 points. And those multiple choice questions are questions that test your retention of the information. They're different than the homework questions, which are geared towards your critical thinking. Part 2 is short answer. You have 8 questions. You get to spend 10 minutes a piece writing on them for a total of 80 minutes to take the test. The questions are worth 5 points apiece. And it's worth 40 points total. Both sections are forced completion, so you'll need to be sure that you have set up some time to have a space where you can totally focus on the exam for that portion of the exam. The exam is timed independently of one another. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So the exam is timed independently, meaning Part A is timed separately from Part B. So your 60 minutes that you use for the multiple choice is solely for the multiple choice, and then the 80 minutes that you use for the short answer is solely for the purpose of the short answer. We time them separately so that you don't accidentally spend too much time in the multiple choice and not get to do the short answer, vice versa. Also, that means that you can take the multiple choice on one day, take the short answer on a different day, so that you can sort of break the test up so you don't have to take it all at once if you feel like taking it all at once is just too much. So what can you use on the exam? You can use your textbook and you can use your lecture notes, but that is it. I absolutely forbid you to use Google. If I think that you have used Google to get information, you will end up with a 0. So please don't do that to yourself. All right, so let's look at the styles that we've gone over. There's a list of styles here to choose from for the exam. Prehistoric, Neolithic, the Ancient Near East, Ancient Egypt, remembering Ancient Egypt is broken up into subcategories. So Ancient Egypt, Early Dynastic, Ancient Egypt, Old Kingdom, Ancient Egypt, Middle Kingdom, Ancient Egypt, New Kingdom, Ancient Egypt, the Amrana period, and Ancient Egypt, the Late Kingdom. So be sure if you use Ancient Egypt, you identify the kingdom that it belongs to. Moving on to prehistoric Greece, you need to tell me whether or not the work of art is Cycladic prehistoric Greece, Minoan prehistoric Greece, or Mycenaean prehistoric Greece. And then we have ancient Greece. So within ancient Greece, we have the geometric and orientalizing period. We have ancient Greek archaic period, ancient Greek early classical, ancient Greek high classical or late classical, and then last but not least, ancient Greek Hellenistic. So let's go back and break down the styles that we studied so far. The features correspond to the review sheet. So we started with Paleolithic. If you remember, Paleolithic art had to be portable. So it is handheld. It focused on religious ritual and social class systems within Paleolithic society. Big firsts, the first signature ever was recorded in the cave paintings during the Paleolithic time. One of the most famous examples that we have of Paleolithic art is the Venus of Willendorf. You also see the human with feline head here. Remember that mankind has not figured out farming yet, and people are hunters and gatherers, but they tend to follow the migration of the herd. So they spend a lot of time running around chasing their food, and they worship bulls. Neolithic art. Neolithic tends to focus on public art for the community. For example, Stonehenge. It also seems to focus on ritual. We see that the handheld art that you see in the Paleolithic time goes away, and that sense of needing spaces to return to for worship purposes becomes very prevalent. Art becomes larger, and we get the first recognizable landscape from this time. Crops are being domesticated. They are not fully domesticated yet, and people now have time for specialized skills. The domestication of crops doesn't necessarily mean that the people are solely living on the crops. That doesn't happen until we get into ancient societies. But at this point, they're gathering and hunting for food. The ancient Near East. So here you see that the ancient Near East is broken down into three subsets: Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian. I'm not going to expect you to differentiate between the three. We look at art from the ancient Near East, and we see art that has to do with power and art that has to do with religion, and some art that deals with both power and religion. They loved pattern, and they had a very stylized way of representing the figure. Oftentimes, the figure had a beard that was organized in an interesting pattern. For example, this statue from the Ashuna temples, the beard goes horizontally in rows. We see as the rulers change hands, the beard does different things. So like in Sargon's time, people wore their beard vertically in rows instead of horizontally in rows. But that beard being laid in rows is iconography for ancient Near East. Men in the ancient Near East tended to be identified by a wrapper or skirt with a bare chest. Works of art that we looked at from this time period were the statues from the Ashuna temple, the Warka vase, the standard of Ur, the stele of Naram Sin, the head of an Akkadian ruler, and the stele of Hammurabi. From this culture, we get the very first hollow cast bronze figures. We know they worshipped bulls. They favored composite figures and composite creatures. Oftentimes they indicated movement by having multiple sets of limbs. They tended to focus on almond-shaped eyes that were wide set apart with a prominent brow ridge. They like to use lapis lazuli in their art. This culture invents writing called cuneiform, often uses registers to organize information. When you get to the Akkadian section of the ancient Near East, King Sargon becomes the first absolute monarchy recorded. and the first divine kingship. We get the very first portrait in the history of art from this era. The first recorded author is a poet named Iduana. And we see that art has opportunities in the citadels that the kings build. Okay, so now we're at ancient Egypt. This one you have to break down each of the individual kingdoms. I don't require you to break down the ancient Near East because it doesn't have as many clear definitive guidelines, but ancient Egypt does. So ancient Egypt in the pre-dynastic often was categorized by these palettes, these eyeliner palettes. The palettes commemorated battles or commemorated important historical information. They used registers to organize information. There was an inkwell, like there is here, for the eyeliner. And we get a good sense of composite view and hierarchy of scale. This is the palette of King Narmer. It commemorates the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Also from the pre-dynastic period, we get the mastaba tombs, and Imhotep comes from this era. He was King Zosier's architect, medic, and physician, I believe. He often created, like a pharmacist. He created medicine for the people of the court. Ancient Egypt Old Kingdom focuses on the pyramids, the Great Sphinx, the seated scribe, and Ka statues. This is the era in which we see the Great Pyramids. First comes the stepped pyramid in the pre-dynastic. The Old Kingdom kings create the Great Pyramids. Diorite was favored mostly for the Ka statues. Art typically is funerary. Ka statues were very popular. Sculpture tends to retain the shape of the block of stone in which it was carved from. And idealism is common in portraiture. This is my Old Kingdom example. It is the Ka statue of Menkaure in Kamaranadabi. It's from Giza. It's made of greywacke, but most of these Ka statues were made of diorite. It still retains the shape of the block of stone from which it was carved. It has sort of a square feeling to it. Kamaranadi wears a gown that is a sheath-like gown that's very revealing of her body underneath. This is the way that the Egyptians provide modesty, but still communicate the sense of ideal beauty. She is married to the king. She presents the king to his people. Remember that ancient Egypt is a matrilineal society. Menkaure steps 1 foot forward with 1 back. He steps a little bit more in front of Kamaranadi. And you see that he wears the Neem's headdress with a false beard and the kilt. Ancient Egypt Middle Kingdom introduces rock-cut tombs. The rock-cut tombs are not as elaborate as the rock-cut tombs in the New Kingdom. And we see a lot more naturalism within the portraiture of Middle Kingdom Egypt. In this time, there are a few families that are in control of power, and they're usually local officials. They're not people that have power over large regions of Egypt, mostly because they're just coming back from the fall of the Old Kingdom's empire. And then we come to the New Kingdom. Ancient Egypt in the New Kingdom was unique because Hatshepsut was the ruler of ancient Egypt in the New Kingdom at the beginning. Amen-Ra took over, and they were both very powerful rulers. We see large, elaborate rock-cut tombs come from the New Kingdom. The very first Clare story comes from the New Kingdom. Here you can see an example of art from the New Kingdom. This is the funerary temple of Hatshepsut. You can see how the temple reflects the natural surrounding behind it. It is very large and grandiose. It features ramps that are bigger than, well, that are taller than about 3 people stacked on top of each other. And at this time, we get a lot of statues of the ancient Egyptian kings, but they aren't Ka statues. Their purpose is not for the soul to inhabit the statue. Why? Because the mummy isn't buried in the tomb like they are in the Old Kingdom pyramids. The mummy is buried somewhere inside the rock cliff face. It protects the mummy and keeps the mummy from being victim to grave robbers. Then we move to ancient Egypt, the Amrana period. In the Amrana period, King Akhenaten was married to Nefertiti. King Tut also comes from this period. Egypt is still unified, and they worship the sun god Aten. During this time, they were conquered by Alexander the Great, and we looked at the bust of Nefertiti. Art is characterized by a curvy presentation of the figure. The figures seem elongated and somewhat rubbery. And we see a feminization and curviness to the human form in general. Here you can see a piece from the Amrana period. This is Akhenaten and his family. And you can see that they sort of have this like stretched out, elongated feel. Their arms don't feel like they have as much bone structure. They seem to have more pudgy skin. Things just feel kind of rubbery and elasticy in terms of representing the figure in the Amrana period. Ancient Egypt in the late period had a callback to the Old Kingdom kings in that they were making art that was similar to some of the Old Kingdom art. However, it was much smaller. So here you see a Ka statue of one of the kings. But this Ka statue is more like a typical life-size person. It's not as large as the Old Kingdom Ka statues. They're also not made of material that's quite as hard to carve. But they still retain the shape of the block of stone in which they came from. Figures are very stiff looking. They have a sense of rigidity to them. Now, ancient Egypt is under the rule of Alexander the Great, and they extend ancient Egypt into Kush, which is the modern day country of Sudan. Commonly, we see pylon temples from the late period, and we see pylon temples that have a flat front facade. And then we move on to Greek. We're looking at prehistoric Greek and the Cycladic. If you remember, the Cycladic was characterized by these flat, small statues that were found in graves. The statues were made of marble, and they often were, well, they were gender deferred. So here you're looking at a female statue. Her arms are clasped across her abdomen, and she has breasts. These figures were polychromed. Often they had eyes painted on, and they had cheeks painted on. The male figures were playing harps to carry with them into the afterlife. These are highly collectible on the modern art market today, and we get a very abstract representation of the figure. Looking at prehistoric Greece and the Minoans, men were depicted in a reddish-brown color, and women were depicted in a light, chalky white color. They love patterning and fresco. They often decorated their palaces with beautiful fresco paintings. The frescoes tend to focus on naturalism and nature, but they highly stylized the people. The people often follow a pattern of large almond-shaped eyes and prominent brow ridge. The frontal eye is common, and typically we see a representation of what ideal beauty in Greece was. The myth of the Minotaur and the myth of King Midas come from this time period. Moving on to prehistoric Greece and the Mycenaeans. This was art that came from the Greek mainland, and art from the Greek mainland was more prominent than art from the Minoans or the Cycladic art, mostly because it was connected to the mainland. It wasn't lost to the sea, and it also it seems like the Mycenaeans on the mainland were able to maintain trading control and things like that more easily. The Mycenaean culture lasts longer than the culture of the Cycladic or the Minoans. They invent corbel vaulting, and they commonly use these beehive tombs that they use to bury their dead. Works of art that we looked at were the Lion's Gate and the Treasury of Arcturus. We know that the Trojan War was going on. They had time to become very good at a niche craft. So the work that I'm getting ready to show you is metalworking. And we know that when the Mycenaean kings die out, Europe goes through a dark ages. Mummification was common, and we see images like this one from prehistoric Greece. It is a funerary mask that went over the mummy. It's done with repoussé technique in a thin sheet of gold. You can see the prominent brow ridge and almond-shaped eyes with the elongated nose and thin lips. Remember, this mask would have wrapped around a mummy. It was a death mask that would have gone on top of the mummy. All right, art of ancient Greece and the Orientalizing period and geometric period. This was the shorter period of art that launches Greece into great society. It's the art that begins the reawakening of Greece after the death of the prehistoric kings. They believe in cremation, and they believe in honoring their ancestors. We looked at the geometric crater from the Dyflon Cemetery. Here it is. You see that they use registers to separate information for the viewer. And you can see the abstraction of the human form and animal form. Ancient Greece in the Archaic period has some very distinguishable features in terms of the face and the way they wore their hair. We looked at the Lady of Auxerre, the Kore and Koros figures. The statues tended to have heavy, prominent brow ridges and featured that archaic smile. There's a sense of rigidity in their stance, very similar to the Egyptian Ka statues. Heroic nudity is a norm, and Greece is suffering from the Trojan War. Here's an example of the Greek Koros from the Archaic period. You get that archaic smile with the prominent brow ridge. This one has a little bit fleshier figure of cheeks. The hair is knotted off and tied in rows down the back. And you get this sense of rigidity that happens in the stance of the figure. Ancient Classical Greek art. This is early Ancient Classical Greek art. There are innovative techniques that come about in portraiture. For one, the contrapposto stance. That's when that weight is shifted onto one leg and one leg slightly bent. It makes the shoulders and the hips go in opposite directions of one another. Statuary remains connected to the strut, and we see that the pelvic triangle is often very pronounced. Figures are extremely realistic to the point where we call them hyper-realistic, and a canon of proportions is used. Nude figures are often gods or goddesses. The archaic smile goes away, and the wet drapery technique is used more prominently. We looked at Aphrodite of Kindos, the Critias boy, and Lysippus the Scraper. Greece is really at its height of innovation at this time, and Athena is the patron goddess of Athens. This is the time period that city-states are constantly at war, and they're trying to control each other's natural resources. One of the statues that we looked at from ancient early classical is Phidias' statue of Athena from the Parthenon. It's 5th century. It is very grandiose, utilizes that wet drapery style, even though it's not completely wet drapery. It doesn't completely cling to the body. Cult statues were common, and they were very large. Athena is represented as the ultimate warrior. Ancient Greek High Classical brings us works of art like the Venus de Milo and Lysippus. Lysippus develops a canon of proportions that's used in studio art today. And we see that the sculpture becomes much more humanistic and relatable. Nudity is normal for both male and female deities. And here's an example of late classical, high classical Greece. This is the Aphrodite of Kindos. It's in the Vatican Museum at Rome. And you can see that Aphrodite has gone from the warrior-like statue that we see of the Athena Parthenos to this more natural, human, relatable statue of Venus. You can see that her robe covers the strut, but she's still attached there to the pedestal. They haven't quite figured out how to liberate the figure from the block of stone. They know how to do it, but they're afraid it leaves the figure way too vulnerable. Proportions are developed by sorry, I lost it. There's a system of proportions that is followed today in studio art, and it comes from the high classical, late classical Greek era. We looked at ancient Greece at the very end, the Hellenistic time, in which art tends to reflect a failing Greek empire. We see much more emotional representation in the art. Drapery tends to hang on to the figure. It clings to the body as if it's wet, but it's a lot more revealing than what we saw in the early part of ancient Greece. The lower rungs of society, the drunkards, the beggars, the slaves, were considered valuable subject matter at this time, whereas at the beginning of ancient Greece, we saw mostly gods and goddesses, kings and queens represented in sculpture. Examples that we looked at were the old market woman, the seated boxer, the Nike of Samothrace. Greece is losing control of its empire, and that's why we see a dramatic shift in art. Here is the old market woman. She stands sort of hobbled over, very emaciated, with her clothing hanging, clinging to her body that's very skeletal looking. She's haggard and tired and very withered, and this sense of pathos comes to mind whenever you look at the old market woman. You feel for her humanity of aging, and we as humans are meant to be moved by these particular statues. She carries on her hip a metaphor for life and death, with the peeps in the barrel and a carcass of a chicken hanging at her hip. And we know that in the Hellenistic era, the empire is growing much weaker, and they're getting ready to be taken over by the Romans. All right, that concludes review for this section, for this exam. I'd like to remind you that the final exam is not cumulative. You'll only be tested on things that we haven't covered in lecture prior. So at this point, be sure that you stick to the eras that we looked at on the first page in terms of classification, and get to know those eras really well before you take the test. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. Happy studying, and I know you'll do well.